A strong point variation. Introduction. An amateur player, often having little time for study, will always find an all-purpose variation useful. If that variation looks sound and is relatively little known, so much the better. This tape introduces you to one such variation, an answer to the popular move 1 pawn to king 4. By analyzing with us a number of illustrative games, you will gain a good understanding of the variation, and you should be able to employ it in your own games. The games themselves are rather unusual. They have not been played by masters and grandmasters, but by a club player, Gordon Higgins, who has part authorship of this tape. Since the listener to this tape will probably be a club player, he will want to know what will happen when he tries out his new opening in the club. So these games, played by club players, will be of immense value. The analysis of the games has been done mainly by me, that is, me, Michael Basman. So, let us go on with the opening. Please have your boards ready, and you should play the black pieces. White's first move is 1 pawn to king 4. Black plays 1 pawn to king 4 back. White knight to kb3. Naturally, white will not always play knight to kb3. The king's gambit, for example, turns up quite regularly, but I expect in your games you would meet knight to king's bishop 3 at least 80% of the time. Now comes the hallmark of the variation, black queen to king 2. Most people will be familiar with the rule, do not move your queen too early in the opening, because it can be easily attacked by enemy minor pieces. Instead, develop your minor pieces first. So from that point of view, this queen move, which incidentally guards the king pawn, is not a good one. It's true that black is defending his king pawn, but why not use a minor piece to defend it, by playing, for example, knight to qb3, or even play pawn to queen 3, which looks a simpler way to guard the king pawn. Furthermore, the queen on king 2 obstructs the black squared bishop on kb1, and that means black will have to take longer in getting his pieces out of the way in order to castle king's side. Doesn't that mean that if black's king stays in the center a long time, he'll be liable to be exposed to attack? Before we explain the ideas behind the queen move, we should first say that the queen is not particularly exposed on king 2. Should white play knight to qb3 here, threatening to gain a little time by knight to queen 5, black parries with pawn to queen's bishop 3, keeping the enemy piece out. One of the most important aspects of chess is pawn play. By playing queen to king 2, black announces that he will develop his pieces slowly. Were there no pawns on the board, this would be a fatal mistake. The enemy would mobilize his pieces quickly, and soon would be invading the black territory. But with the pawns, black intends to use them to keep the opposing pieces out. We just had one example of a pawn keeping out an enemy piece when we suggested that white's move knight to qb3 should be answered by black pawn to queen's bishop 3. At the same time, if black is to be able to develop his pieces in the long run, he must have a certain amount of space, and his fair share of the center. Black has already put his pawn on king 4, and he intends to buttress it there by moves such as knight to queen 2 and pawn to queen 3. It is very unlikely that white will be able to take that point, so black will be in no danger of being pushed off the edge of the board, as happens sometimes with some of the modern defenses, which allow the opponent to flood the center of the board with pawns. Very well then, if white cannot easily take the king 4 square, that is black's king 5 square, Can't he open the queen's file and invade with his major pieces? Say he plays here after black queen to king 2, white knight to queen's bishop 3. Let's make these moves on the board. Black pawn to qb3, white pawn to queen 4, black pawn to queen 3. White plays pawn takes pawn, and black plays pawn takes pawn. Here white has the open queen file, and perhaps he can use it to put his rooks on, and then invade the black position that way. In theory, this should be a good plan, but in practice it is not so easy to carry out. The reason for this is, I think, similar to the reason that white knight to queen 5 is a bad move here. If white were to play knight to queen 5, black would play pawn takes knight. The knight is worth 3 points, the pawn only 1. Same thing goes with the rooks. Supposing white puts his rook on the queen's file and then tries to enter black's position via the squares queen 6, queen 7, or queen 8, none of which are now guarded by pawns. The invading rooks might then find themselves harassed by the enemy bishops and knights, which are worth 3 points, while the rooks are worth 5. That is one reason why rooks become stronger in the endgame, particularly when the minor pieces have been exchanged. Then they can go more or less where they like, as long as they avoid squares guarded by enemy pawns. Well, there's another way that white may try to open lines for the attack, and that is by playing pawn to king's bishop 4. Quite often, after white has castled king's side, he has a rook on kb1, and if he manages to play pawn to king's bishop 4, he opens the file for the rook. This can be a very dangerous plan, because with a white bishop at queen's bishop 4, both rook and bishop would be bearing down against a weak spot in the black king position, the king's bishop 2 square. This square is regarded as weak because at the beginning of the game it is only guarded by the black king. However, we can see that there are some difficulties in white playing pawn to kb4 in this position. For a start, he has already put his knight on kb3, so he'll have to move it first to be able to play pawn to kb4. But the plan of pawn to king's bishop 4 is a dangerous one nevertheless, and you should watch out for it in your own games. So in effect, by playing queen to king 2, black is saying to white, I'm giving you a lead in development. You can bring out your pieces as quickly as you like, but you'll find that your pieces alone will be unable to break down my position. This is actually very frequently what happens, and it causes a lot of frustration and puzzlement among players of the white pieces, who, having completed their development, then think that the game should be won already. Well, after this discussion, we'll go over to the first game. Please return your pieces to the start position and switch off the cassette if necessary. After the moves 1 pawn to king 4, black pawn to king 4, white knight to kb3, black queen to king 2, white knight, queen's bishop 3, black pawn to queen's bishop 3, white bishop to queen's bishop 4, black played pawn to king's rook 3. He doesn't automatically develop here by knight to king's bishop 3, as this could land him in some trouble after white's knight to king's knight 5, when the bishop and knight combine to attack the kb7 square. So black played pawn to king's rook 3. Now white expands in the center with pawn to queen 4, and black ensures that he will be able to retain his pawn at king 4 by playing pawn to queen 3. White castles kingside. Notice here that white has succeeded in bringing out 3 minor pieces, and is already castled. So far, black has only moved pawns and its queen. White's castling kingside is possibly a little premature. It immediately tells black where the white king is going to be for the rest of the game, and therefore black knows where to launch an attack. It was possibly more flexible to keep black guessing a little as to whether the king was going to be placed on the queen's side or the king's side. However, castling kingside is quite a regular sort of move, and certainly many club players will make it without a second thought. After white has castled, black played pawn to king's knight 4. What began as a solid defense is now beginning to look quite aggressive. Black is advancing against white's castled position. The move pawn to king's knight 4 is also defensive in a sense. It is now doubly difficult for white to open the king's bishop file against the black king, with 2 black pawns or eyeing the kb4 square. The one potential disadvantage of the move pawn to king's knight 4 is structural. It weakens the white squares at black's king's bishop 4 and king's rook 5. Squares on black's 4th rank, which can now never be guarded by pawns. To understand this point, look at black's 4th rank. His pawns at queen's bishop 3 and queen 3, and king's rook 3, combine to keep out the white pieces, particularly the knights. But were black to unwisely play a move such as pawn to queen's bishop 4, this would allow the white knight at qb3 to immediately leap in at queen 5. The same thing applies to the squares at black's kb4 and kr4. Only at the moment there are no white pieces ready to take advantage of these weak squares. But it's quite possible for white to develop a long-term plan to maneuver a piece round to one of the weak squares on the king's side, for example by knight to king 2 to knight 3 to kb5. We can also see that it would be advantageous to white if he could somehow induce black to exchange off his white squared bishop, that's the one on qb1, for this is the piece which guards the weak square, the one at kb4. Have a look at diagram A, where you can see an example of white having taken advantage of the weakness of the king's side to gain a strong knight outpost. After this digression, we'll continue with the game. So black played pawn to king's knight 4, and white now played pawn takes pawn, black pawn takes pawn, white bishop to king 3, black knight to queen 2, white queen to king 2, and the black knight from king's knight 1 came out to bishop 3. With this last move, black has plans to play his knight to kr4 and then into kb5, attacking the white queen at king 2. If white then exchanges by playing bishop takes knight, black can answer knight's pawn takes bishop, and this opens up the kn file, king's knight file, where his rook can be placed for an attack against the white king. In view of this threat, white might well have been advised to play his knight, which is now on kb3, over to queen 2 at this point. This would have prevented black from playing knight to rook 4, because, of course, it would be answered by queen takes knight. If black still wanted to play a knight round to kb5, he would have to do it the long way, by moves such as bishop to knight 2, and then knight from queen 2 to kb1 to king's knight 3, and finally to bishop 5. Well, in the game, from diagram 1, white omitted this precaution and played pawn to queen's rook 4. Possibly he thought that black's last move, which was knight to kb3, 3 threatened some moves such as pawn to queen's knight 4 and then pawn to knight 5, which might enable black to capture the white king pawn. At any rate, after white's move pawn to queen's rook 4, black played knight to king's rook 4. Please switch off your tapes and study this position for a few minutes. White has a little combination here, which doesn't work, but we shall look at it all the same because there are some positions where it does work. White can play here knight takes king's pawn. And after black plays knight takes knight, white plays queen takes knight on rook 5. Here white's won a pawn. Unfortunately, black now plays knight takes bishop and white loses a piece. But let's suppose white's bishop had been on queen's knight 3 in this position, instead of playing the move pawn to queen's rook 3. Would the combination have worked then? No, it still wouldn't have worked, because black could play the move bishop to king's knight 5, and this would trap white's queen. Well, this is a useful trap to remember. You might yourself be able to pull it off in one of your games. Now let's return again to diagram 1, adding the moves white pawn to queen's rook 4 and then black knight to rook 4. White now continued pawn to king's knight 3 to keep the knight out of kb4. Black played knight from queen 2 to bishop 3, and white played king's rook to queen 1. Black now played rook to king's knight 1. Because white has castled kingside, black wishes to use tactical methods to get his knight into kb4. He threatens knight to bishop 5 again, and if white then plays pawn takes knight, black answers knight's pawn takes pawn, discovered check. And after white's king moves, black can regain his piece by pawn takes bishop. Of course, were white's bishop not on king 3, the discovered check continuation would not have regained the piece. Now, after black's rook to king's knight 1, white moved knight to queen 2. And now black moved his knight into kb5. It's quite probable that white never saw this move coming, otherwise he might have moved his bishop from king 3, or played king to rook 1 last move. And in this position, too, it would have been prudent to have played bishop takes knight here, instead of the move which white actually played, which was knight's pawn takes knight. Black played knight's pawn takes pawn, discovered check, and white moved his king to rook 1. Black pawn takes bishop, white queen takes pawn. Please switch off the tape and study the position for a few moments. As can be seen, material is completely even, but white's incompetent defense has led him into a storm on the king's side, while black's king, which is in the center, is still in no danger. Black moved knight to king's knight 5, attacking the queen, and white found a good reply in queen to bishop 3. This move is good because it prevents black queen to rook 5. In view of the reply, queen takes bishop's pawn check. So here black may have done well to play his rook from king's knight 1 to king's knight 2, thus defending the kb2 square, as well as threatening both knight takes rook's pawn and queen to rook 5. In the actual game, black played rook to knight 3, which has the idea of continuing rook to kb3, attacking the white queen. White defended against this by playing his rook from queen 1 to kb1. Black played pawn to kr4, white pawn to king's rook 3, and black bishop to rook 3. It's true that black's knight at kn4 is attacked, but so is white's knight at queen 2. So white played his rook, queen's rook to queen 1 now, black bishop to bishop 5. This is a very powerful move, scotching forever any threats of white's against the black kb pawn. And of course, white cannot play pawn takes knight here, because of the reply queen to rook 5 check and a quick mate. The rest of this game is sheer destruction. White rook to king's knight 1, black queen to rook 5, white rook to knight 2, black rook to bishop 3, white knight to king's bishop 1, black bishop to king 6, discovering an attack against the white queen. White plays rook takes knight here, black bishop takes rook, white queen took the bishop at king 3, black rook to bishop 6, and here white resigned. Well, what do you think of that? A very powerful attacking display by black, and it shows how strong black's counterplay can be against automatic play. White made a probable error in castling kingside so early. He also did not defend well against black's plan to place a knight at kb4. For example, if you remember, on move 10, he should have played king's knight to queen 2, preventing black's knight to rook 4. He could also have defended better by playing bishop takes knight instead of pawn takes knight, thus avoiding the total opening of the king's knight file, though it's true by that time black had the makings of a good attack. After black's 16th move, white's game seems completely lost. In game 2, the white player is more circumspect and places his king on the queen's side. Please have your pieces set up in the starting position, and we'll look at this game. 1 pawn to king 4, black pawn to king 4, white knight to kb3, black queen to king 2, white knight to queen's bishop 3, black pawn to queen's bishop 3, white plays pawn to queen 4, black pawn to queen 3. Here white moved bishop to king's knight 5, something of a blow in the air if you ask me. Black replied knight to kb3, white pawn takes pawn, and black pawn takes pawn. White bishop to queen's bishop 4. And notice how black's placing of his queen at king 2 allows him to avoid the exchange of queens after the pawns have been exchanged in the center. Also, the queen at king 2 does give some protection to the kb2 square, which is often a problem square for black. Now let's continue with the game to the position in diagram 2, after white's moved bishop to queen's bishop 4. Black here developed his own bishop with bishop to king's knight 5, which is an alternative plan to the last game where the bishop was left at home for a long time on QB1. White continued queen to queen 3. Black moved his queen's knight to queen 2. White played pawn to king's rook 3. Black bishop to rook 4. Possible here was bishop to king 3 as well. White pawn to king's knight 4. Black bishop to knight 3. Please switch off and study this position for a little while. Well, did you switch off? Now it's white here who has advanced with pawn to king's rook 3 and pawn to king's knight 4. But as black has not yet castled kingside, the advance does not constitute an attacking threat. Black has threats himself in this position, particularly to white's king pawn, by moves such as pawn to queen's knight 4 to 5, and also by knight to bishop 4. White therefore parried this threat with the move bishop takes knight, removing one of the attackers on the king pawn. Black played queen takes bishop. White castled queenside, and black also castled queenside. Black has once again come out of the opening quite well. His bishop at KB1 will prove a good piece, and white has some kingside weaknesses to worry about. White here played king to knight 1. Black's bishop moved to QB4. Possibly even stronger than that was bishop to queen's knight 5, because then black has threats to white's king's pawn by knight to bishop 4, and also by threatening bishop takes knight. However, the move played bishop to queen's bishop 4, attacking the king's bishop's pawn, is also pretty strong. White answered bishop to bishop 4 by playing queen to king 2. Here again, black could play bishop to knight 5, which seems to put white under great pressure, particularly with regard to his king pawn. But black chose a rather more risky continuation. Pawn to queen's knight 4. Have no fear. Sacrifice bishop takes knight's pawn, pawn takes bishop, white queen takes knight's pawn, is not very strong, for then black replies queen to knight 3. So instead of sacrificing, white meekly retreated by playing bishop to queen 3. Black moved his knight from queen 2 to knight 3. White pawn to king's rook 4, threatening to trap the black bishop with pawn to rook 5. So black stopped this by playing pawn to king's rook 4. White pawn to king's knight 5. Black queen to king 2. At this point, white must have noticed that his knight at queen's bishop 3 had no square to go to, and therefore the black move pawn to queen's knight 5 was threatening to win it. Therefore white played pawn to queen's rook 3 here, which saves the piece, but does leave his king vulnerable to attack, either by the eventual sacrifice bishop takes rook's pawn, or the line opening move pawn to queen's knight 5. Black could prepare for these attacks by marshalling his forces here, say by playing king to knight 1, rook to queen 2, king's rook to queen 1, and then even rook to queen's knight 2. But first he brought his bishop on king's knight 3 into play by making the move pawn to kb3. White pawn takes pawn, black pawn takes pawn, white king's rook to king's knight 1, black bishop to bishop 2. Possibly white wanted to play rook to knight 7 here, but then he noticed it lost the exchange to bishop to rook 7 check. So he prepared this move by playing king to bishop 1. I'd like you to switch off the tape now and consider your next move as black. Black now unleashed a deadly combination with bishop takes rook's pawn, pawn takes bishop, queen takes rook's pawn check, white king to queen 2. This guards the knight at queen's bishop 3, but only for a moment. Black knight to bishop 5 check, white king to king 1, black queen takes knight check, white king to bishop 1. Now black had 2 extra pawns as well as an attack, so the rest of the game we shall go over quickly, since, well, we know that black's winning, don't we? The remaining moves were bishop to king 3, white rook to knight 7, black king's rook to knight 1, white rook to knight 3, black rook takes rook, white pawn takes rook. Black pinned here, bishop to knight 5, white queen to bishop 2, black king to knight 1, white king to knight 2, black pawn to king's bishop 4, pawn to kb4, white rook to king 1, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, rook to kb1. This puts tremendous pressure on the knight at kb3. White goes rook to king 2. Black knight goes back to queen 3. White rook to king 3. Black knight takes bishop. And here white resigned. Probably after he plays rook takes queen, black knight takes queen, white king takes knight, black can play pawn to king 5, which will win him a piece. In this game too, black mobilized his pieces quickly and had no real difficulties. But couldn't white have done better? Let's return the pieces to diagram 2 and analyze a bit more. Well, have you got the diagram position? In this position, black played bishop to king's knight 5 and white played queen to queen 3, which lost a clear tempo because the queen was then subject to attack by knight to bishop 4 and also along the queen file. Had white played queen to king 2 and then after black queen's knight to queen 2, white plays pawn to king's rook 3, black bishop to rook 4, white pawn to king's knight 4, black bishop to knight 3, white then castles queen side, and black castles queen side. Now the queen is no longer exposed on king 2 to these various attacks, and white could play knight to rook 4 here. That's knight to kr4, and he'd have quite a good game. because he might be able to put his knight on bishop file. Still, black is quite a good game as well. Another possible improvement for white in the early stages of the game is to delay the exchange of pawns in the center. This is by playing queen's pawn takes king's pawn. It's unlikely that black himself will exchange by king's pawn takes queen's pawn, since he's trying to maintain a strong point at king 4. It's unlikely that black will in fact want the king file completely opened, especially as he's got his king and his queen on that file. They might fall foul of a white rook at some point. Now, on the other hand, by not making the exchange in the center, white keeps the black position locked up. He denies the use of the black diagonal kv1 to queen's rook 6 to the black bishop, and also the square queen's bishop 4 is denied to the black knight. White also retains the option of playing pawn to queen 5. So, that's given white a few ideas. Now we shall play over game 3, where in fact white does not exchange pawns very early in the center. Please have your pieces set up in the original position, and we can look at game 3. Let's begin pawn to king 4, pawn to king 4, knight to kb3, black queen to king 2, white knight to queen's bishop 3, black pawn to qb3, white pawn to queen 4, black pawn to queen 3, and now white plays his pawn up to king's rook 3. White is playing more circumspectly here, preventing the development of black's bishop to king's knight 5. Black played now his knight to queen 2, and white modestly developed his bishop on king 2. Black knight from king's knight 1 went to bishop 3. Here, however, white did not castle, but moved bishop to king 3, and so black now played pawn to king's knight 3. Since white has not committed his king, black doesn't think it a good idea to weaken his king side squares with the moves pawn to kr3 and pawn to kn4. On the other hand, he must develop his king's bishop, and hence it goes to king's knight 2, fianchetto. White played queen to queen 2, black bishop to knight 2, white castled queenside, and black castled black castled kingside here. Right. Please switch off the cassette here and study the position. In my opinion, white has quite a good game here, certainly better than the previous 2 games. That doesn't mean, of course, that your opponents will play the opening so well. White has placed his bishop at king 2 instead of the more obviously aggressive queen's bishop 4. He has not castled king's side, and he has not exchanged the central pawns prematurely. He has good control of the center, and he has chances on the king's side with moves like bishop to rook 6 and pawn to king's knight 4. Black also has chances. For example, he may be threatening pawn to queen's knight 4, expanding on the queen's side, and threatening to win white's king pawn with pawn to knight 5. Now, before going on with this game, we'll consider a couple of positional ideas which might arise from this position. Let's think about what would happen if white tried to invade on queen 6 here by playing pawn takes pawn, black pawn takes pawn, white queen to queen 6. Then black would continue with queen takes queen, white rook takes queen, black rook to king 1. White now doubles on the queen file with king's rook to queen 1. However, this whole maneuver doesn't have that much force because black plays bishop to bishop 1, ejecting the rook, and when it retreats to queen 2, black's bishop to queen's knight 5 is quite strong. Please return the pieces to diagram 3. Now suppose it were black's turn to move in this position, which it isn't actually. But if it was, what if he played pawn to queen's knight 4 here? When someone plays a move like pawn to queen's knight 4, it's worth considering whether you can play pawn to queen 5 in reply. This can be quite helpful. Say, if black replies to pawn to queen 5 with pawn to queen's bishop 4, then white can take off the knight pawn, which no longer has a defense. Now, after black plays pawn to queen's knight 4, white plays pawn to queen 5. We won't look at first at whether black should capture the queen pawn. Let's look and see if black can answer by playing something like pawn to knight 5. This is pawn to queen's knight 5. Now if the white knight moves, black can play pawn to qb4. He no longer loses his queen's knight pawn, and he's also advancing quite soundly down the center. So after pawn to knight 5, white would have to play pawn takes bishop's pawn, but black would then play pawn takes knight. And now white could not play pawn takes knight on queen 7 because of the reply pawn takes queen check. So this whole sequence of moves shows that the move pawn to queen's knight 4 is a threat by black, and white therefore has to take some steps against it. Now to go back to the game position, this is in diagram 3. In that position, white played bishop to rook 6 to exchange the bishops. In this position, black had the possibility of trying to win white's king's pawn by playing pawn takes queen's pawn. It's not generally a thematic move to do this, as I've mentioned before, because it relinquishes the strong point at king 4. On the other hand, it is sometimes a good move, as it does give black access to the squares qb4 and k4, even though it does also leave a backward pawn at queen 6. But this can often be compensated by black's pressure against the white king pawn. After the move black pawn takes queen's pawn, black is definitely threatening to win white's king's pawn. So I'd like you to turn off the tape and analyze the position. Well, I hope you've done some analysis, and what did you come up with? In the first place, white cannot play queen takes queen's pawn, of course, because of black bishop takes bishop check. Instead, white could play knight takes queen's pawn. When black wins a pawn by playing knight takes king's pawn, white knight takes knight, black bishop takes bishop. White, queen takes bishop. And now black, queen takes knight. In this position, though, white may get good play for the pawn by playing pawn to king's rook 4 and pawn to king's rook 5. Well, my engineer, whose name is Prince, tells me that we've had 44 minutes of this tape, so we'd better turn over to side 2. The strong point variation, side 2. Please have your pieces set up in the position of diagram 3, with the addition of the move white bishop to rook 6. Now, in reply to black's pawn takes pawn, white has another continuation besides recapturing knight takes pawn. This is for him to play bishop takes bishop. Now, if black plays king takes bishop, white will play queen takes queen's pawn, guarding his king pawn. So instead of this, black plays pawn takes knight, attacking white's queen. Here white has only one way to avoid losing a piece. This is queen to rook 6. Black pawn takes pawn check, white king to knight 1, black rook to king 1. Black is now nominally 2 pawns ahead, but after the move white knight to king's knight 5, his position doesn't look good. White threatens bishop to queen's bishop 4, and to defend against this, black plays pawn to queen's knight 4. Now white seems to have several good attacking moves, for example, pawn to king's rook 4, pawn to kb4, or doubling rooks on the queen file. Black is very tied up, as his king's knight cannot move in view of the attack against king's rook 7, and as well as that, the queen's knight can't move because it has to defend the king's knight, which is defending king's rook 7. Well, I think that's sufficient analysis of the position arising from black's move pawn takes queen's pawn. So please return your pieces to diagram 3. After white plays bishop to rook 6, black moved pawn to queen's knight 4, as we said he would, and this threatens pawn to knight 5 and knight takes king's pawn. So white clarified matters with bishop takes bishop. Black king takes bishop. White pawn takes king's pawn. Black pawn takes pawn. White king to queen to king 3, guarding the pawn at king 4. Though white has exchanged off black's bishop at king's knight 7, and thus weakened black's king's side, in a sense he has eliminated black's bad bishop. A bishop is called bad if its lines are blocked by pawns of the same colour. Here the position is open, but white's bishop is slightly bad because it stands on a white square, the same square as the white king pawn. For a better understanding of the consequences of a bad bishop, see the cassette Rook and Bishop versus Rook and Knight Endings by David Hooper. Now in the game, after white's queen to king 3, black continued pawn to queen's rook 4, white pawn to kn4, black knight to queen's bishop 4. There's a threat now of pawn to queen's knight 5, which again wins the white knight. Almost does. So white made way for it by playing bishop to queen 3. Black played bishop to rook 3. Please now turn off the tape and study the position. Right, have you studied the position? It's very delicately balanced, with both sides having possibilities of attacks on the king. White's most dangerous plan is to try and set up a position where he has a queen at king's knight 5 and a knight at king's knight 3. Then black would be in a double pin against his knight at kb3 and his pawn on king's knight 3, and white would then be threatening knight to bishop 5 check or knight to rook 5 check. In both cases this knight wouldn't be able to be taken, and in fact black would have to move his king away, in which case he would probably lose his own knight on kb3. Of course, black could defend against these threats by putting his king on rook 1 first, and then the checks just won't exist. But this might let white in other ways. Incidentally, I'm not sure if I like black's last move, which was bishop out to rook 3, because that bishop might have been needed on queen's bishop 1, ready to capture a white knight if it came into kb5, whereas black will now have to capture it with a pawn if it gets there, and this might give white a good attack along the open king's knight file, probably in a similar way to what happened in game 1, but with reversed colours. Well, in the game, white chose to play his knight to king 2 in this position, and he's obviously trying to move it to knight 3 and round to bishop 5 possibly. He could also have tried to playing king's rook to knight 1, which threatens pawn to king's rook 4 and then pawn to rook 5. Now knight to king 2 by white is quite double-edged, because it takes away one of the defenders of the white king. For example, black could now play his knight to rook 5, which threatens black queen to knight 5, with an attack against the white pawn at queen's knight 2. Now against knight to rook 5, white seems to have to play pawn to queen's bishop 3. That stops queen to knight 5. And then if black tries to open the game further with pawn to knight 5, white can block it up by bishop takes bishop, black rook takes bishop, then white pawn to queen's bishop 4. In the game from diagram 4, if you have the right position, black chose king's rook to queen 1. And now, instead of the natural move knight to knight 3, with the plan of queen to knight 5, which threatens the aforementioned knight checks, and also, by the way, the black king pawn, white suddenly got the wind up. His next two moves were distinctly poor. Knight from king's bishop 3 back to king 1. Black moved knight to rook 5. And now white played queen to queen 2, a rather fatal lapse of concentration. It does stop queen to knight 5, but it loses a pawn quite easily by knight takes king's pawn because of the pin on the queen file. So after this, white quite soon lost the game as well. Well, despite the flaws, this game does bring out many of the ideas in the positions that arise from this opening. So now we'll go on to game 4, which shows a blocked center arising. If you have the pieces set up in the start position, we'll begin again. Pawn to king 4, black pawn to king 4, white knight to kb3, black queen to king 2, white develops bishop to queen's bishop 4, black pawn to queen 3, white knight to queen's bishop 3, black pawn to queen's bishop 3, course, to stop that knight coming in on queen 5. White pawn to queen's rook 3. The idea of this move is to give the white bishop a retreat square at queen's rook 2, as well as protecting the knight at queen's bishop 3 against an attack by pawn to queen's knight 4 to 5. Well, black continued with knight to queen 2. White played queen to king 2. Black pawn to king's knight 3. White pawn to queen 4. Black bishop to knight 2. Well, white now saw that his pawn was threatened at queen 4, and rather than exchange, he pushed on with pawn to queen 5. With this move, the centre gets blocked up. It looks a bit inconsistent as well of white, having gone to all the trouble of safeguarding his bishop at qb4 with pawn to queen's rook 3, to then block its diagonal with pawn to queen 5. However, we'll leave that. Now, a good long-range plan for black in this position, now that his king's pawn is no longer under fire, is to play for an eventual pawn to kb4. Say by the move black knight to kb3, castles, then pawn to qb4, completely locking the center, then moving the knight back to king 1 and pushing it on with pawn to kb4, as occurs in many lines of the king's Indian defense, to which this defense is very similar. Well, the game actually went from diagram 5, black king's knight to bishop 3, white bishop to king's knight 5, black pawn to kr3, white bishop back to king 3, black castles, white queen to queen 2, threatens the rook pawn, black king to rook 2. Possible here, instead of king to rook 2, was knight to king's knight 5, and later black could prepare for pawn to kb4. Well, after black's king to rook 2, white played pawn to king's rook 3, which now prevents knight to king's knight 5. Black played pawn to qb4, and white pawn to king's knight 4. Please switch off and study this position for a while. White has been able to keep his king in the center in this position because of the blocked center. He doesn't want to have his king on the king's side, where it will interfere with the attack, and he doesn't want the king on the queen's side, because black will then open lines on the queen's side with moves like pawn to queen's rook 3 and pawn to queen's knight 4. The critical question now for white is whether he'll be able to open up lines on the king's side. Often it's a very close run thing. The safest move for black in this position is to play either knight to king's knight 1 or knight to king 1. This is to avoid the striking blow white pawn to king's knight 5, which will force black to allow an exchange of pawns on the king's side and thus open up the files. After, say, black in this position plays knight back to king's knight 1, how does white make progress? He can play pawn to king's rook 4, but then after he plays pawn to king's knight 5, black can block with pawn to king's rook 4. Or if white tries the other pawn move, pawn to king's rook 5, black blocks again with pawn to king's knight 4. This sort of resource for the defending side, when two pawns abreast face each other, is an important one to remember. In fact, in the latter case, that is, when white gets his pawn up to king's rook 5 and black plays pawn to king's knight 4, white can still make progress in this position, but he'd have to do it by bringing his knight, queen's knight, round via king 2 and king's knight 3 into kb5, thus occupying a good post. And later white would need to put his king on the king's side, which is now blocked up, and then transfer his attention to a breakthrough on the queen's side. This is fairly long-winded, but it is a blocked position, and such plans are quite common in such positions. In fact, in the position of diagram 6, Black did not wish to take a defensive measure such as knight to king's knight 1, and straight away began queenside activity with pawn to queen's rook 3. Please now switch off the tape and analyze the consequences of White's move pawn to king's knight 5 here. Black could try, after White's pawn to king's knight 5, knight to king's knight 1. But after pawn takes pawn, Black bishop takes pawn, White pawn to king's rook 4, it's difficult for Black to stop further line opening by pawn to king's rook 5. Let's replace those bits. This is the White pawn on king's knight 5, Black bishop on knight 2, pawn on kr3, Black knight on kb3, and White's pawn is on king's rook 3. Now Black could also capture on king's knight 5, and then White will have the choice of recapturing either with the bishop or with the knight. Whichever way White captures, if he wishes to make further progress, he wants to be able to play pawn to king's rook 4 to rook 5 and open up the king's rook file. Black's only real defense to this is to try and lock his knights at kr4 and kb3. That formation is hard to break down. However, White can prevent Black from setting this formation up. If, after Black plays pawn takes knight's pawn, White plays bishop takes king's knight's pawn, this pins the knight. Black unpins with queen to king 1. Then White plays pawn to kr4, and Black plays knight to king's rook 4. And it looks in this position as though Black is going to be able to set up some defense and stop White opening the files. So let's have a look at the other recapture to see if we can have a better success with it. This is the position of diagram 6 here, and you add the moves pawn to queen's rook 3, and White plays pawn to knight 5, and Black captures that pawn. So we try the other recapture, which is White knight takes knight's pawn check. Black plays king to knight 1. Now in this position, White doesn't play pawn to king's rook 4, which is answered by knight to king rook 4, but first White goes bishop to king 2. Now if Black plays knight to king's rook 4, White will just play bishop takes knight, and then it'll get very drafty down the king's knight file. Instead, Black can play pawn to queen's knight 4, which threatens pawn to knight 5 and things like that. But then White plays bishop to kb3, and if pawn to queen's knight 5, White brings his knight round to king 2. You can see with all this, White is gradually transferring his pieces onto the king's side. And Black will find the threat of White knight to knight 3, followed by pawn to king's rook 4 to 5, rather hard to meet. Well, so much for the analysis of White's pawn to king's knight 5 move. Please now return to the position of diagram 6. And, of course, add the move Black pawn to queen's rook 3. Well, pawn to knight 5 seemed to give White good chances of pressing his attack. However, he didn't play it. And he didn't play another good move, which would have been pawn to queen's rook 4. Instead, he played a rather insipid move, and pointless, which was bishop to queen 3. Black expanded with pawn to queen's knight 4, and White continued in style with pawn to queen's knight 3. Black developed his bishop, bishop to queen's knight 2. And now at last white struck with pawn to king's knight 5. However, in this position, black did not capture it. He retreated knight to king's knight 1. And now, remarkably enough, white did not capture on rook 6 and follow up with pawn to king's rook 4. But he moved pawn to king's rook 4 immediately. Well, naturally, black seized his chance now to block things up totally on the king's side. He played pawn to king's rook 4. Well, black has been able to block up the king's side, and the only real prospects in this position lay with black. Of course, he must never open up the king's side. He has to rely on his queenside pawns to make progress. After black's pawn to king's rook 4, white moved knight to king 2. Please switch off the tape and choose a move for black. White's play over the last few moves has been so disastrous that his promising position has quite evaporated. But you mustn't think that this is going to be unusual. You may often find in your games at club level that your opponents play fairly well up to a point, but then lose their way. And we've seen this in both these two games from the play of the white pieces. But black's play has been rather more purposeful. Now in this position, black rubbed everything home with bishop takes queen's pawn. White captured, pawn takes bishop, and now came pawn to king 5. This regains the piece with a fork, and as a bonus, the black bishop at king's knight 2 happens to attack white's rook at queen's rook 1. White moved this rook to queen's knight 1. Black pawn takes knight. White knight to knight 3. White has got a small threat here of knight takes rook's pawn because of the pin on the king's knight pawn. Please switch off the cassette and decide on your next move as black. Black played pawn to queen's bishop 5. White pawn takes pawn. Black pawn takes pawn. White bishop takes bishop's pawn. And after queen's rook to bishop 1, white regretted having captured the pawn. If he moves his bishop, then black plays bishop to queen's bishop 6, winning white's queen. Instead, white tried rook to knight 4. But after pawn to queen's rook 4, white rook to rook 4, black knight to knight 3. That's all right. The bishop cannot take the knight on knight 3 because it's pinned. Well, after knight to knight 3, white resigned because he's losing a lot of his pieces. Now, to conclude the tape, we'll look at a couple of lightweight attacking affairs from the black side. If you'll reset your pieces at move 1, we'll go on again. Let's start. White pawn to king 4, black pawn to king 4, white knight to kb 3, black queen to king 2, white bishop to queen's bishop 4, and black plays here pawn to queen 3, white knight to queen's bishop 3, black pawn to qb 3. We've seen all these moves before, of course. Now, white didn't expand in the center with pawn to queen 4. He just played himself pawn to queen 3. And black played bishop to king's knight 5. White also moved bishop to king's knight 5. Black king's knight to bishop 3. White castles. Black queen's knight to queen 2. White queen to king 2. Black pawn to king's rook 3. White bishop takes knight. Now here, if black plays either queen or knight takes bishop, they both look pretty good. But instead, black chose to play pawn takes bishop. White answered pawn to king's rook 3. Now if black retreats his bishop to king 3, white will play knight to kr4 followed by queen to bishop 3, and he'll be trying to exploit the weak square at kb5. Thus, black sacrificed his bishop in this position by playing pawn to king's rook 4. Please switch off the tape and decide whether the piece could be captured or not. Now, after white's pawn takes bishop, black pawn takes pawn. White moves knight to rook 2. Black pawn to kb4. White is now faced by a terrific threat of queen to rook 5 and queen takes knight mate. Now against this threat there seems to be only one reply, which is pawn to king's knight 3. However, this seems adequate. If black now plays, say, queen to knight 4 to try and get his queen over into the rook file, then white can answer pawn to kb4, and his queen will guard the knight at king's rook 2. So I think that this analysis shows that black's play was probably rather over-optimistic, and he'd have done better to have captured with either the queen or the knight earlier on. Still, white was impressed by the piece sacrifice, and from diagram 7, if you have the pieces in it, you'll see he didn't take the piece. He just left it there and played queen to king 3. Rather a dithery move, but he was no doubt shocked by the unexpected aggression shown by the player of the black pieces. This you can probably count on in your games. So queen to king 3 happened, black moved his bishop out to rook 3, and white had to go back to king 2, clearly losing a temper. Now black carried on in grand style, castling queenside, and white, in full retreat, moved knight to queen 1, black queen's rook to knight 1, this has a threat. White played king to rook 1, black bishop to bishop 5, white knight to king 3. Black now moved his knight to knight 3, white queen's rook to queen 1. White is just wriggling away here. Pawn to queen 4 by black. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. White knight takes pawn. Black knight takes knight. White bishop takes knight. Now here black finished things off with bishop takes rook's pawn. Pawn takes bishop. Queen to queen 2. This threatens both queen takes rook pawn check and the bishop. So white gave up his bishop with bishop takes knight's pawn check. Black king to knight 1. White moved now knight to knight 1, at least defends the pawn. But after the next move, rook takes knight check, king takes knight, queen takes rook's pawn, white resigned. Now for another attacking game. Both sides probably attacking, but black more successfully. Starting from move 1 again. Pawn to king 4. Black pawn to king 4. Knight to kb3. Queen to king 2. White bishop to queen's bishop 4. Black pawn to queen 3. White castles. Black pawn to king's knight 3. Again, white plays here quietly. He goes pawn to queen 3. Black bishop to knight 2. White knight to queen's bishop 3. Black pawn to queen's bishop 3. White knight to king's knight 5. In some other games on this tape, we've seen black playing an early pawn to king's rook 3 to avoid the white knight sally to king's knight 5. But this game shows that it's possible to allow these knight attacks too, and they may not be too dangerous. After white's knight to king's knight 5, black defended with knight to king's rook 3. And now came the dangerous thrust, pawn to kb4 from white. The moving of the knight has enabled white to open up the kb file with pawn to kb4, and things look very bad for black. White seems to have a perfect attacking position. However, appearances are deceptive. For a start, black could simply play pawn to kb3 here, and drive white's knight back to kb3. Then he can continue himself by moving knight to kb2, and he'd have a very solid position. His pawns would all support each other in the center. In the game, black chose the move bishop to king's knight 5. White moved his queen to king 1. He could have tried bishop takes pawn check, but I doubt if that would have succeeded. So white played queen to king 1, and now black knight to queen 2. Please switch off the tape now and study the position. There doesn't seem to be an obvious way for white to improve his position here. He can try a sacrifice by knight takes king's bishop's pawn. Black knight takes knight. White bishop takes knight check. Black queen takes bishop. Now white pawn takes pawn. But after black queen to king 2, white doesn't seem to have a piece, the worth of a piece for his sacrifice. Now from diagram 8 again, another move which is promising in appearance is pawn to king's bishop 5. This for a start threatens pawn to king's rook 3, trapping the black bishop at kn4. But black can continue against this quite brutally with pawn takes pawn, and if white plays pawn takes pawn, then black just moves pawn to queen 4, which looks pretty strong. Or if white tries pawn to king's rook 3, then black can move pawn to bishop 5, and after pawn takes bishop, black can play queen takes knight. Again, black seems to be on top. After pawn to bishop 5, white could probably play knight takes bishop's pawn, but it still looks quite a good position for black. So let's return to the game now, and this will be diagram 8. From diagram 8, white played pawn to king's rook 3. Black dropped his bishop back to king 3. White moved knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight. White queen to knight 3. Black castled queenside. White moved pawn takes pawn, and black played bishop takes pawn. Well, the bishop is attacking the white queen, so of course white hasn't got any time to play bishop takes knight on rook 6. It looks like the safest move for white here is to move his bishop out to kb4, but the position still looks pretty good for black. Actually, white moved queen to bishop 2, queen to kb2, which he must have thought was a good idea because it attacks the knight at rook 6, and also the queen wants to take the pawn on rook 7, on queen's rook 7. Well, please switch off the tape and decide your play as black. Black himself went over to the attack with queen's rook to kb1. White queen takes rook's pawn. Black rook takes rook check. Actually, black could also have played bishop to rook 7 check here, followed by rook takes rook. But the move he chose was even more deadly. So he went rook takes rook check. White king takes rook. Black rook to bishop 1 check. White king to knight 1. Black queen to bishop 3. This has a double threat. Bishop to queen 5 check, winning the white queen, and also queen to bishop 8, winning the white king. So to stop these, white played bishop to king 3. Now it's your turn again. Switch off and find a move for black. Black brought his knight in, knight to king's knight 5. The knight is untouchable because of queen to rook 5 and a quick mate. And meanwhile, black threatens knight takes bishop, followed by bishop to queen 5, if white recaptures that knight. The remaining moves of this game were bishop takes king's pawn. This is white's move. Black knight takes bishop. White bishop takes knight check. Black doesn't bother now to recapture the bishop, which allows queen takes knight's pawn check. So he moved king to bishop 2. If white now plays queen to rook 5 check, then king will go to knight 1. So white played bishop takes bishop's pawn. And after queen to bishop 8 check, white resigned. To end the tape on a positional note, we'll have a look at a fairly determined effort by white to exploit the queen file and the black queen 6 square. Please return to the start position. Play the moves pawn to king 4, pawn to king 4, knight to kb3, queen to king 2, knight to queen's bishop 3, pawn to queen's bishop 3, pawn to queen 4, pawn to queen 3, bishop to king's knight 5, knight to kb3, bishop to king 2, queen's knight to queen 2, white castles, black pawn to kr3, white bishop to king 3, pawn to king's knight 4 by black, pawn to king's rook 3, black bishop to knight 2, white queen to queen 2, black knight to kb1, white king's rook to queen 1, black knight to knight 3, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, white queen to queen 6, queen takes queen, rook takes queen. White has managed to position his pieces at queen 6 and he has control of the queen file, but black can equalize the position. After white rook takes queen, black castled, white knight to rook 2, black knight to bishop 5, white bishop to bishop 3, black bishop to king 3, white queen's rook to queen 1, black king's rook to king 1. Now black is threatening the ejection procedure, commencing bishop to kb1, so white played knight to knight 4 here. Instead of capturing, black played knight to rook 2. He's going to push back the white pieces with moves such as pawn to king's rook 4 and bishop to bishop 1. And after this, the game equalized and was eventually drawn. Well, I hope this tape has given you the flavor and confidence of this variation. Good luck with it in your own praxis, and please send up any interesting games you may play with it in the future. You may even get them published in the Audio Chess news sheet. So cheerio for now then.